Good afternoon and welcome to this, the first instalment of the Humane Philosophy Project Ian Ramsey Centre for Science and Religion seminar series of 2016-17 on the topic of supernaturalism. I'm Ralph Waldo. I'm here to welcome you on behalf of the Humane Philosophy Project, which is an organisation run between Blackfriars Hall, University of Oxford, the Ian Ramsey Centre for Science and Religion at the University of Oxford, and the Institute of Philosophy at the University of Warsaw. We're really grateful for all of these organisations for making this series and the Humane Philosophy Project possible. I'll now hand over to Andrew Pinsent, who's going to introduce our speaker for this evening.
Well, thank you very much. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Emily Dumler-Winckler from the University of Notre. I have to say, this is a bit of a providential opportunity because I was planning to give the first of the lectures of the series, but we had a sudden communication from Notre Dame University from Professor Celia Dean Drummond, and to let us know that Emily was in the country over these dates and would like to give a presentation. So we very much leapt at this opportunity. So Emily Dumler-Winckler is a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Notre Dame in the Centre for Theology, Science and Human Flourishing. She earned her MDiv, THM and PhD from Princeton Theological Seminary. She specializes in moral theology, historical, doctrinal and systematic, with a particular interest in virtue, moral philosophy and psychology, aesthetics, politics, science and social change in the modern era. Her research brings ancient and medieval thought to bear on modern and contemporary debates on religious ethics. Her dissertation, Modern Virtue, Edmund Burke, Mary Wollstonecraft and a Tradition of Dissent, challenges the narrative of virtue's modern demise by offering an account of modern virtue, specifically the virtues of democratic social criticism and friendship. In her work with the Centre at Notre Dame, she's developing a theology of homemaking, which examines how the practices of modern science and religion have shaped our relationship to the natural world for better and worse. This project considers the virtues needed to perfect these practices and so make a home of the shared world we inhabit. The title for her talk today is The Holy Matrimony of the Modern Poet and Scientist. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to begin by thanking Andrew Pinsent at the Ian Ramsey Center, as well as Mikolaj Slakowski-Road, did I say that correct? And Ralph Waldo at the Humane Philosophy Project for having me. It's really a joy and a pleasure to be here, so thank you so much for the warm welcome. It's also somewhat fitting to be beginning with Wordsworth today. Of course, he was here and was inspired by the grandeur and the learning of Oxford University. He called it a seminary or a nursery for blooming youth. So he would be quite thrilled to see it alive and well today. So thank you. What is a poet? This is William Wordsworth's question in the second edition of the Preface to Lyrical Ballads, one that he answers by comparing the poet with the modern scientist in a light favorable to both and suggesting for them a shared aim. Following Wordsworth in his 1844 essay, The Poet, Ralph Waldo Emerson takes up this question with a similar cast of characters and themes, intent to show that the distinct vocations of the poet and the man of science, as well as their partnership, depend on genius, or what Emerson calls, quote, the enchantment of the intellect, end quote. During a period when the divorce between science and poetry was beginning to appear all but settled, Wordsworth and Emerson officiate a holy matrimony between the two by understanding both as smitten interpreters of the book of nature. Despite the increasingly widespread belief in the finality of the divorce, Wordsworth and Emerson join the good company of a distinguished legacy of poets, divines, philosophers, and scientists, including the likes of Sir Humphrey Davy, Michael Faraday, William Whewell, and Charles Darwin, who avoid this mistaken view and affect the happy partnership in their own time. With this marriage, Wordsworth, Emerson, and their fellow transatlantic romanticists resist the disenchanted view that there is no aspect of nature not subsumed by modern science, that there is in the world no enchantment, no value, however sacred or secular. Indeed, they resist the crude modern dichotomy between a vulgar naturalism and supernaturalism, and not only, as we will see, by way of natural supernaturalism narrowly conceived. Before we turn to this holy matrimony and the various threats of an annulment, we would do well to briefly consider various ways that the divorce has been conceived. This may appear out of order. Why consider the divorce before the marriage? Well, simply put, this union or reunion, like that between Christ and the church foretold in the book of Revelation, only makes sense in light of the separation that precedes it. Of course, M.H. Abrams, in his masterful book, Natural Supernaturalism, demonstrates that the marriage metaphor, prominent among a number of major English and German writers of the 18th and 19th century, depends for its power on the metaphors of divorce, disenchantment, and alienation, all of which draw heavily on Christian theological themes of history, human destiny, and happiness. Indeed, these romanticists' efforts can be understood as attempts to translate the theological concepts and themes of Milton's Paradise Lost and Regained into a late modern vernacular, both sacred and secular. Nonetheless, the nature of the divorce, and thus the proposed marriage, is variously depicted by those within and beyond romantic circles. Francis Bacon's aim in The Great Insaturation is famously to investigate whether a union between mind and nature might restore humanity to its prelapsarian condition by establishing, quote, forever, a true and lawful marriage between the empirical and the rational faculty, the unkind and ill-starred divorce and separation of which has thrown into confusion all the affairs of the human family, end quote. Likewise, Wordsworth Novalis, Thomas Carlyle, and Samuel Taylor Coleridge each announced the good news of a possible marriage between mind or spirit and nature. William Blake's Bard in Jerusalem arouses Albion from his sleep of death so that he can join Jerusalem in a loving embrace in the dawn of the eternal day. Percy Shelley's Prometheus Unbound culminates in a renovated world that has as its central and cosmic symbol the happy union of Prometheus and Asia. So too, Friedrich Schlegel sought to overcome the divorce between philosophical ideals and physical science. Frederick Schelling, that between Greek myth and Christianity, and Coleridge, that between Christian creeds and an emerging secular metaphysics. And the list goes on. The point of this whirlwind survey at high altitude is not to obscure all the relevant differences between these thinkers. It's rather to suggest that the divorce and marriage metaphor was used in a variety of ways. Is there a common thread that ties this metaphor together beyond the metaphor itself? Abrams adopts as his title Carlyle's phrase, natural supernaturalism, in Sartor Resartus, which he took to signal Carlyle's attempt to, quote, naturalize the supernatural and to humanize the divine, end quote. Given this title, it may seem curious that Abrams does not use modern debates about naturalism and supernaturalism prominent in the first half of the 20th century to frame the apparent paradox of natural supernaturalism. As Akil Bilgrami notes, Abrams does not explicitly formulate this distinction at all. He scarcely mentions either term, and the book may be better for their absence. Isms often obscure more than they illuminate. Nonetheless, it may be helpful to see how they frame the portrait of the marriage given in this talk. Because the long and varied history of both terms in Western thought has been the source of ongoing debates, a word, but only that of clarification, is in order. Modern debates, which are best understood as a response to the rise of modern science, at the most basic level distinguish naturalism, understood as the view that all objects, truths, and facts fall within the scope of scientific inquiry broadly, from supernaturalism, understood as the view that certain entities and occurrences fall outside the scope of scientific inquiry. Let us call this the basic distinction. For our purposes, it will help to name two other forms that this distinction can take: ontological and methodological. An ontological distinction arises from forms of naturalism which hold that everything that exists falls within the scope of natural science, and forms of supernaturalism which maintain the existence of entities and beings beyond the scope of natural science. And a methodological distinction can be drawn between forms of naturalism which hold that genuine knowledge is only attainable through the methods of scientific inquiry broadly conceived, and forms of supernaturalism which hold that knowledge can also be attained through non-scientific modes of inquiry, such as divine revelation. As Molly Farneth notes, a decisive question to put to each form is what it means by natural science or scientific inquiry. A range of answers yields more and less restricted versions of each. Debates have become most heated, for instance, when either ontological or methodological naturalisms are paired with a materialist philosophy of science, which yields a highly restricted notion of scientific inquiry, one that tends to define itself polemically over and against supernaturalism and idealism. These have fueled the notorious conflict myths so prevalent in debates about religion and science. For our purposes, the point is that all three of these forms, the basic, ontological, and methodological, enable us to make distinctions between naturalism and supernaturalism without divorcing or opposing the two altogether. That is, as Wordsworth says, to make a distinction without a divorce. Notions of a divorce or bitter opposition arise from materialist philosophies. Moreover, these forms are not mutually exclusive. For instance, an ontological supernaturalist could in principle hold methodologically naturalist views. Abrams' book demonstrates, though not in these terms, that romanticists resist the divorce created by materialist philosophies of science. His book is replete with poetic examples of how radically secular romanticists use theological and religious themes to resist the disenchanted view that nature is entirely subsumed by materialist philosophies of natural science. But there is no value or meaning in worldly objects. The relation of Abrams' book to the basic ontological and methodological distinctions I've drawn, however, is more ambiguous. For Abrams, the title indicates that his, quote, recurrent but far from exclusive concern will be with the secularization of inherited theological ideas and ways of thinking, end quote. This is no doubt one of the book's great contributions. Nonetheless, Abrams' focus on secularization throughout can be interpreted as conveying a modern shift from supernaturalism to naturalism at the most basic level, as a narrative of modern secularism. In his view, Romanticism does not so much achieve a happy marriage between the two as eclipse supernaturalism altogether. But this secular narrative threatens to elide the remarkable sense in which Romanticism was a movement capacious enough to encompass the development of theological themes and idioms among both radically secular as well as deeply theological thinkers. And this sheds light on another facet of Romanticism, namely that the movement can be understood as not only resisting the material forms of the dichotomy between naturalism and supernaturalism, but as also consecrating a holy matrimony or civil union, as the case may be, between modern naturalists and supernaturalists, poets and scientists alike. This suggests that there's a more interesting and indeed compelling way of interpreting Romanticism as a movement and natural supernaturalism than as a narrative of modern secularization. In the preface to the second edition of Lyrical Ballads, Wordsworth is not willing, at the behest of his friends, to provide a systematic defense of the theory undergirding the poems. The request reveals the false assumptions that he either could or ought to reason his way to their acceptance, argue for their public approval, or guarantee that popular taste is sufficient to find them both palatable and nourishing. As Emerson observed, Wordsworth, following his genius, was, quote, self-assured that he should create the taste by which he is to be enjoyed, end quote. Indeed, the request exposes a fundamental misunderstanding of the more basic question, quote, what is a poet? In the 1802 edition, Wordsworth appends a lengthy section devoted to this theme. Here he affirms, quote, a poet is a man speaking to men, a man endowed with more lively sensibility, more enthusiasm and tenderness, who has a greater knowledge of human nature and a more comprehensive soul than are supposed to be common among mankind, end quote. And the litany of superabundance continues. The poet, quote, rejoices more in the spirit of life that is in him and manifested in the going-ons of the universe, has a disposition to be affected more than other men by absent things as if they were present, end quote. Emerson follows this basic description in his essay, The Poet. He writes, the poet is representative. He stands among partial men as the complete man and apprises us not of his wealth, but of the commonwealth. The young man reveres men of genius because, to speak truly, they are more himself than he is. They receive of the soul as he also receives, but they more, end quote. For both romantics, the poet imbibes and bestows more soul, more life, more beauty, more truth, qualitatively more than the rest of us. Emerson joins Wordsworth and Aristotle in understanding the poet as a sayer, a namer of truth. Wordsworth has heard that for Aristotle, quote, poetry is the most philosophic of all writing, end quote, and he couldn't agree more. Quote, its object is truth, by which he means the general and operative, not standing on external testimony, but carried alive into the heart by passion. Truth which is its own testimony, which gives competence and confidence to the tribunal to which it appeals and receives them from the same tribunal, end quote. It would be difficult to find a less Kantian portrayal of truth than this, passion's living gift to the heart. But neither can it be reduced to a Humean sentimentalism. For Wordsworth and later Emerson, this living truth is a product of interpretation, however seemingly spontaneous and intuitive, a loving perception of the world. By the time he appends this section in 1802, it seems, Wordsworth has become convinced that both the poet and the natural philosopher or man of science are interpreters of nature, whose shared object is truth. David Bromwich convincingly suggests that Wordsworth came to this idea of the scientist under the sway of Sir Humphrey Davy's 1802 introductory lecture on general chemistry at the Royal Institution. Here, as if naming the Romanticism at the heart of the scientific enterprise, Davy suggests that the chemist, quote, must interrogate nature with power, and that the study of nature, therefore, under any aspect whatever, must always be more or less connected with the love of the beautiful and the sublime, end quote. The more connected it is with this dimension, at once aesthetic and moral, the more he believed, quote, science may become a source of consolation and happiness by purifying the imagination and attaching the affections to important objects intimately related to the interest of the human species, end quote. It's no wonder that Wordsworth finds this portrayal of science immensely appealing. At a time when the divorce between poetry and science was beginning to appear inevitable, poetry understood as an aesthetic language without truth, and science as an objective truth without language, this poet and scientist reconciled the two by seeing the likeness of each in the other, by understanding one another as enamored interpreters of nature in all its sublime beauty. Both men question the presumption that nature can ever be read without such an interpreter, one who says, as Wordsworth pens at the crux of his poem Michael, quote, into that simple object appertains a story, end quote. Despite the increasingly widespread belief in the finality of the divorce, one reflected in vulgar forms of the dichotomy between naturalism and supernaturalism, Davy and Wordsworth cleared the way for a legacy of poets, divines, philosophers, and scientists to avoid this mistaken view. William Whewell famously coined the term scientist in an 1833 meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, when Samuel Taylor Coleridge forbade the learned gentlemen to dignify themselves with the term philosopher. But Whewell was not so interested in the distinction himself. For him, what sets both scientists and philosophers apart from their fellow interpreters is that, quote, most men are unconscious of this perpetual habit of reading the language of the external world and translating as they read, end quote. A genius of poetry or natural science must become at least somewhat conscious of this habit, this work of translation. The habit may become an unconscious disposition again insofar as it becomes second nature, but the poet and the natural philosopher share this work of interpretation. Darwin followed suit when in a letter to T.H. Huxley he applauded him for having so articulately written what Darwin himself had so often said and thought, namely, quote, that the process of scientific discovery was identical with everyday thought, only with more care, end quote. In fact, Laura Dassa Walsh observes that influential scientists like Michael Faraday and T.H. Huxley rejected the term scientist because they preferred to think of their work as part of the broader philosophical, theological, and moral concerns. Faraday was a devout Presbyterian who not only understood his work in physics as a form of worship, but spoke openly about how his theological beliefs informed his scientific hunches. These preeminent scientists were perfectly happy to think of themselves as interpreters and their work as intimately connected to the concerns of humanity. In like manner, Emerson never uses the term scientist, preferring terms like man of science, natural philosopher, and naturalist. We can reasonably suspect, as Walls does, that his refusal to adopt the term reflects his rejection of the strict bifurcation between philosophy, theology, and poetry on the one hand and modern science on the other. Emerson repeatedly affirms that the vocations of the poet and the man of science depend on genius. Quote, the enchantment of the intellect and its twin substance of the soul, love, the enchantment of the affections. Genius, according to his early lecture of that title, is a sacred power. Quote, in all works, books, acts, manners, words to which the sacred emphasis of genius attaches, it is not mere man, but more than man that worketh, end quote. Genius is an energy, a power, an infusion, an enthusiasm that awakens and overawes and takes us somewhat by surprise. It is first and foremost a matter of reception. At the same time, it's no less the activity which prepares the decay of things. He would later describe genius as the creative action of the soul, quote, the sound estate of every man, end quote. Emerson knows that the secret of the world is profound and that we require all manner of interpreters to read it. Yet with Kant and Whewell, he finds it somewhat baffling that most of us rely on the interpretations of others, that, quote, the great majority of men seem to be minors who have not yet come into possession of their own, or mutes who cannot report the conversations they've had with nature, end quote. Conversely, the value of genius to us is in the veracity of its report. Having read and interpreted nature, whether visible or invisible, the genius reports back. The particular genius of Wordsworth and Emanuel Swedenborg for Emerson is the reform they wrought in philosophy, namely, quote, the bringing of poetry back to nature, undoing the old divorce in which poetry had been famished and false, and nature had been suspected and pagan, end quote. In representative men, Swedenborg is Emerson's representative mystic. It's no coincidence that this genius, quote, which was to penetrate the science of the age with a far more subtle science, began its lessons in quarries and forges, in the smelting pot and crucible, in shipyards and dissecting rooms, end quote. According to Emerson, he anticipated much of 19th century natural science. But what's most interesting for our purposes is Emerson's approving comment that Swedenborg, quote, thought as large a demand is made on our faith by nature as by miracles, end quote. Mystics, poets, and naturalists alike exercise faith as they interpret the book of nature. In the preface, Wordsworth is as interested in what distinguishes as what unites the poet and the man of science in this holy matrimony. His motto, knowledge is pleasure, a play on Bacon's knowledge is power, is true for both. The immediacy of pleasure and its tendency to connect human beings sets them apart. Tutored by Edmund Burke, Wordsworth knows that, quote, we have no sympathy but what is propagated by pleasure, end quote. Even sympathy with pain is accompanied by what Burke calls a certain delight. The chemist, mathematician, or anatomist, whatever pain, difficulty, or disgust she has encountered in her work, knows this pleasure and delight. With Davy, Wordsworth perceives that pleasure accompanies the love of the sublime and the beautiful, intrinsic to the study of nature. He also perceives, however, that it often comes as the hard-earned reward of thankless labor. Pleasure does not necessarily accompany the scientist each step of the way. Neither do others find immediate pleasure in the scientist's knowledge. Moreover, the pleasure we take in science does not directly inspire sympathy or love for our fellow human beings. Pleasure for both the scientist, then, and her audience is more remote than for the poet and hers. The poet, conversely, finds pleasure quite throughout her work, and those with eyes to see and ears to hear sympathize immediately. In fact, the only restriction binding the poet is, quote, the necessity of giving immediate pleasure to a human being, not as a lawyer, a physician, a mariner, an astronomer, or a natural philosopher, but as a man, end quote. A heartbeat is the only condition. In Emerson's terms, genius gives the poet an immortal errand and ensures its success. The following passage is from a lengthy paragraph in Genius that Emerson uses word for word in his essay, The Poet. quote, when the soul of the poet has come to the ripeness of thought, it detaches from itself and sends away from it poems or songs, a fearless, sleepless, deathless progeny, which is not exposed to the accidents of the weary kingdom of time, end quote. The virtue of the poet's soul endows their fearless offspring with wings that transport and implant them directly into kindred hearts, despite the swarm of censors that threaten to devour them. Far from degrading the poet's work, the condition of immediate pleasure is a reflection of its dignity, of the fact that the poet names for all sympathetic souls the beauty of the universe, quote, a task light and easy to him who looks at the world in a spirit of love, end quote. To be sure, the poet's not blind or deaf to the vertiginous mixture of pain and pleasure on our verdant and perilous globe. Rather, she sees and names the world as it is in all its beauty and sublimity, love and hatred, justice and injustice, comedy and tragedy. But she does so with the firm confidence that our sympathies produce an excess of pleasure and joy. As a grieving Emerson wrote shortly after the death of his first son, Waldo, quote, life is a series of surprises, and would not be worth taking or keeping if it were not, end quote. The poet names the odd gratification that accompanies grief, the reassurance that one has loved deeply. Wordsworth summarizes, quote, the knowledge both of the poet and the man of science is pleasure, but the knowledge of the one cleaves to us as a necessary part of our existence, our natural and unalienable inheritance. The other is a personal and individual acquisition, slow to come to us, and by no habitual and direct sympathy, connecting us with our fellow beings, end quote. With this distinction in place, and with the scientific and industrial revolutions already well underway, Wordsworth is careful to emphasize the enduring necessity for both the poet and the man of science, for both sciences in our modern era. If the men of science were to bring about a material revolution in our condition, he assures us, quote, the poet will sleep then no more than at present, end quote. The scientist, in other words, cannot replace the poet, for even the most remote discoveries of science will be, quote, the proper object of the poet's art, end quote. We will need the poet's interpretations. With his fellow romantics, Wordsworth earned a reputation for his opposition to the actual and potential detrimental effects to the scientific and industrial revolutions. Here, however, he appears more ambivalent, even hopeful, not on account of scientific progress in se, but rather its connection to poetry. Quote, if the time should ever come, he imagines, when what is now called science, thus familiarized to men, shall be ready to put on, as it were, a form of flesh and blood, the poet will lend his divine spirit to aid the transfiguration, and will welcome the being thus produced as a dear and genuine inmate of the household of man, end quote. This warm welcome is especially striking to our post-Frankenstein 21st century ears. But Wordsworth is no less aware of the dangers of the scientific ambition to create a new being, or the political ambition to create a new man in 1802, than Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley was in 1818. Both were indelibly shaped by the events of the French Revolution. Long before Shelley's now famous Frankenstein, A Modern Prometheus, in 1818, in 1790, to be precise, François Félix Nogaret wrote a political allegory about scientific progress, in which an inventor named Frankenstein creates a life-sized automaton. The 1970 version was explicitly revolutionary, but for obvious reasons, he became increasingly ambivalent about the promises and perils of scientific progress and the prospects for revolution, with each subsequent edition over the next decade. It's not clear whether Shelley actually heard of Nogaret's work, but she undoubtedly read Wordsworth's Preface. Most interpreters agree, if about nothing else, that Shelley's novel illuminates the dangers of modern scientific, technological, and political ambitions, not merely to mirror God or image God as co-creators, but to supplant God as sui generis creator of the new man. Some see this as the temptation of par excellence of modern science. In keeping with Wordsworth and Davy, Frankenstein can be read as a parable of what goes terribly wrong when the scientist understands her task as more or otherwise than that of interpretive creativity, when the study of nature becomes less about a love of sublime beauty and more about the scientist's sublime power, when ambition and talent corrupt rather than purify the imagination, eclipsing matters, quote, intimately related with the interest of the human species, end quote. That's Davy again. Reading the novel through Wordsworth's preface suggests yet another layer. In Shelley's rendering, Victor Frankenstein's monster receives no warm welcome from the poet, no infusion of a divine spirit. Indeed, de Lacy, the old Parisian father, is the only one to welcome the creature as a dear and genuine inmate of the household of man, in Wordsworth's words. But then again, he is blind. His more perceptive children cast the monster out of their cottage, the event which precipitates the murderous trajectory of the novel. With Wordsworth, Shelley suggests that absent the poet's divine spirit to aid the transfiguration, the discoveries and inventions of modern science and technology may remain soulless creatures that threaten to become monstrous at the slightest provocation. As the past 2 centuries have shown, science can be put to better and worse, good and evil, salutary and horrific use. The Wordsworthian, quote, being thus produced, the one that the poet welcomes into the human household, is importantly the product of both scientific and poetic genius, of scientific and poetic knowledge enlivened, even transfigured, by a shared concern for the interests of humankind. Poetry for Wordsworth is, quote, the breath and finer spirit, the first and the last of all knowledge, end quote. The implication is that without this moral, dare we say divine influence, it is not prudent to welcome a creation of science, however close its resemblance, as a beloved inhabitant of our human home. In Emerson's words, quote, it is by the religious sentiment that the universe is made safe and habitable, not by science or power, end quote. The de Lacy children were wise in this regard. Frankenstein's monster may be what we get when science puts on a form of flesh and blood without the genius of the poet to assist the metamorphosis. That is, when science assumes a divine prerogative without a divine spirit. Alternatively, Emerson writes, quote, when science is learned in love and its powers are wielded by love, they will appear the supplements and continuations of the material creation, end quote. So Emerson shares the concerns of his romantic forebears about poets and scientists who lack a hallowing presence. Frankenstein serves as a vivid depiction of knack and skill and talent gone terribly wrong. In these instances, when a work lacks love, beauty, and goodness, quote, the intellectual gifts do not make the impression of virtue, but rather of vice, end quote. Wide is the gulf then between talent or ambition and genius. His essay, The Poet, is an extended reflection on the perils of impoverished poetry and meager science and a hope of both perfected by genius. In the same breath that he worries, quote, our science is sensual and therefore superficial, he adds, quote, the state of science is an index of our self-knowledge. Everything in nature answers to a moral power, end quote. Pardon me. I'm so sorry. And this is true of science, he writes, referring to science in the sense of knowledge broadly. The poet alone knows astronomy, chemistry, vegetation, and animation, for he does not stop at these facts but employs them as signs. Yet Emerson looks in vain for the genius poet that he described. With messianic anticipation, he awaits, quote, the timely man, the new religion, the reconciler whom all things await, end quote. America for him remains a song unsung and a poem unwritten. Only months prior to delivering the lecture Genius, Emerson left the ministry. Disappointed with the church, though not with God or theology broadly, he turned to poetry and science. Quote, a poet in his walk, he wrote, has mused on the supreme cause and written out that shall be theology for the next age. Some chemist has detected a subtle affinity that instantly to his eye shoots its roots through nature, end quote. All works of genius, then, from the chemist's discovery to the poet's songs, far from the products of divine ambition, are rather, quote, a species of worship of the supreme being, end quote. I'll conclude with the following reflections. If William Shakespeare, undisputedly the greatest English poet of the 16th century, passed the designation on to John Milton in the 17th century, the honor was passed with no little contestation at the turn of the 19th century to Wordsworth. The hesitation for some had to do with the seemingly secular nature of his poetry and its culmination in the prospectus. William Blake, for instance, quote, took offense at Wordsworth's literary enterprise because it paralleled his own, but deviated on the crucial issue of naturalism, end quote. It's only as an afterthought that William Blake would then name Wordsworth, quote, a pagan, but still the greatest poet of the age, end quote. That is to say, as Abrams so ably does, that Wordsworth provides a distinctly secular appropriation of the theological themes and concepts featured in Milton's Paradise Lost and Regained. But in the very same instance, it is to say that Romanticism also included a range of religious, theological, and even orthodox Christian thinkers, such as Blake, Coleridge, and Emerson. Yet Abrams describes Romantic philosophy and literature broadly as displaced and reconstituted theology, or, quote, else a secularized form of devotional experience, end quote. But this language of displacement, echoed again when he writes of the, quote, general displacement of ancient theological ideas from a supernatural to a natural frame of reference, end quote, does not adequately capture the fullness or variety of unions embodied in the Romantic movement. It not only wed the secular modern scientist and poet in opposition to various materialist naturalisms and their deleterious effects for nature and human communities. It birthed a distinguished legacy of modern thinkers who would continue to express their shared concerns and hopes in both theological and secular idioms, who would identify shared commitments among both ontological and methodological naturalists and supernaturalists. Because 19th century Romanticism and its legacy includes this breadth, natural supernaturalism is better understood, I suggest, not as a form of either naturalism or supernaturalism, but rather as a wholly modern matrimony between varieties of naturalism and supernaturalism. For Romanticists, such as Wordsworth and Emerson, were eager to understand and adopt the insights of modern science, but they were also keenly aware of the limitations and dangers that attend certain modern scientific practices and Enlightenment views of nature, disenchanted views that tend to alienate us from God, nature, one another, and ultimately from our own agency. The happy marriage of the poet and the scientist I have suggested, then, is crucial if we're to make a shared home of the modern world that we inhabit. Thank you.
Very much. I think we have some time for questions. So, do you want to choose the questions yourself, or shall I do it for you?
I'm happy to do it.
Fine.
Yes,
Okay.
that's no problem. Yes.
So thank you very much, Emily, for your talk, which I really enjoyed. I wanted to say as an aside that Wordsworth has played a strangely prominent role in the Humane Philosophy Project. The project's named after a paper by John Cottingham, who I first heard speak in this room as it happened, and he opened with a quotation from the Prelude. And next week, one of our other sub-projects, the Value of Humanities Research Group, will have its first meeting of the year in Wordsworth's old bedroom at St. John's College, as it happens. I'm also a great fan of Wordsworth myself, and I had I was going to say two connected questions, but it's a lie. You only have to answer one if you like. The first was, I was just thinking at the end, you described Wordsworth as being perhaps ambiguous on the question of naturalism and being, in some sense, secular in comparison to other Romantic poets. You mentioned Blake. Perhaps an even more obvious example would be Gerard Manley Hopkins. Nonetheless, I was wondering how naturalist is Wordsworth if you read something like Intimations of Immortality or perhaps Tintern Abbey. It seems to me there's a deep sense of religiosity and explicit reference to God and all the rest. The broader question I wanted to ask was how much do these ideas apply to poetry as opposed to other art forms? It interests me that frequently in the history of aesthetics, ideas are put forward first about poetry and then come to be accepted about art generally, and that's true from Plato and Aristotle onwards. It's true in 18th century aesthetics and modern aesthetics that bloomed from that. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on both or either of those.
Both excellent questions, thank you. I don't weigh in this paper on the question of how religious or secular is Wordsworth to be interpreted. In part, I'm trying to push back against Abrams' depiction of the whole Romantic movement as a sort of secularization, right? So what I do in this paper is at least cede him the ground. If he wants to read Wordsworth as a secular thinker, then okay, right? Perhaps there's ground for that. And perhaps there's not, as you point out in some of these other texts, Tintern Abbey. And the same question arises in Emerson's scholarship, and I'm trying to do this similar thing with Emerson, which is to say, there's no sense in which we can really read Emerson, and I'm more familiar with Emerson's corpus as a whole than I am Wordsworth's, to be honest with you. But I want to say something similar with him, I think, which is that he can be read secularly if you want to read a certain transcendentalism out of all of his references to God. But I think that's actually really difficult at the end of the day. You can't quite make sense of what he's saying or doing. And it's at least not the kind of materialism that Abrams, of course, wants to resist and thinks that the Romantics resist. But I also think it's a more robust form of supernaturalism, especially the earlier quote that I drew out from Emerson, where he insists that there's something, that genius is something beyond man. It's something beyond the human level. It's a sort of reception from at least some spirit being power beyond. So, and I think that question also remains open in Wordsworth. So thank you for pointing that out. To your second question, I think it's an excellent observation. I think that, I guess if I could reframe your question, are you asking whether or not, or maybe you could say it one more time, are you asking whether or not, or how it is that the aesthetics of poetry relate to certain other art forms?
Yeah, that's right. I was wondering how much various aspects of your talk apply specifically to poetry as opposed to other art forms in general. And of course, Romanticism was a movement in other art forms. Not
right,
just
exactly. I think it applies pretty broadly. In fact, one of the things that's not explicit in this talk, but implicit, I guess, in the way that I was trying to frame it, is that I think most of the Romantics, and again, this comes back to what I do in the end with Emerson, actually perceive the poet as a sort of kind of new messianic figure, right? And so poetry and the poet was kind of the pinnacle of this expression of philosophy, which then I think has all sorts of aesthetic implications and moral implications as well for how art is perceived in other art forms, whether it's painting, sculpture, other forms of literature, and so on. So.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks. Suppose we take very seriously your suggested project at the end about poetry and science. The urgent question then is, how do we go about implementing this? What do we do next, if you like, to reconcile scientific and poetic views? Well, there are many ways we could come at this, but one thing that strikes me here is that depending on our definition of philosophy, the earliest well-formed work of Western philosophy was a poem by Parmenides. I mean, maybe Thales is a philosopher, maybe he's proto-scientist. Now, Parmenides is a poet, I mean, not a terribly good poet as I understand it, but he's a tremendous philosopher. But the thing is, this dichotomy between naturalistic science and poetry, as we try to define it, doesn't exist in Parmenides. Now, I don't think it's not terribly interesting that all this is happening at the chronological beginning of Western philosophy, but it's happening at a very fundamental level. It's happening. His thought is primordial with regard to the dichotomies between poetry and science construed naturalistically. Now, if you look at Parmenides, the whole poem is about being. It's about being. Now, you probably know that in philosophy, I mean, including philosophy faculties, there are people who've got a rough idea of what's meant by being, or the question of being, or what is it to be, and there are people who've got absolutely no idea and think the question is nonsensical.
Yeah.
But I think if we can begin to make sense of the concept of being, there might be a way forward at a primordial level to integrate science and poetry into something, spiritually more healthy and aesthetically more healthy. I mean, there are theologians who have a profound understanding of being. I include Augustine and Thomas in that. There are poets who have insight into being, sheer being. Coleridge calls it pure being. Hegel has an understanding of it. So I think that, I think your prescription at the end is extremely healthy, but we've got to think how to go forward in it, especially when there's so much ideological weight put on secularism for all sorts of reasons in modernity and in the demystification of society, for various reasons, political and economic reasons.
I appreciate the comment. I didn't hear a question, but I'm happy to respond.
Yeah, I don't think it was a question.
Okay.
Is any of that true?
Is,
The usual thing to ask, what's wrong with it?
well, I suppose my own response would be that I'm not sure if the way forward is through the way of being, or through a way back to the kind of union that was wrought, the ancient union that was wrought in, I'm more familiar with Aristotle, but Parmenides it sounds like as well, and the sort of naturalism that was kind of endowed with this spirituality and sense of being and all the rest. I think what's most interesting to me about the way in which the modern conversation and split between naturalism and supernaturalism has evolved, and the kinds of distinctions that I was trying to draw, is that whether or not one wants to make a commitment to a supernaturalist ontology, there's still all sorts of room for agreement and conversation at the level of methodology, between method, I think, again, like I said, I think that an ontological supernaturalist can still be a methodological naturalist. There's all sorts of instances of those. Kant was probably one, and I'm sure many of the Romantics were as well. But that opens up a whole different kind of space. The problem, as I can conceive it, is that the divorce is wrought when we think of naturalism in purely more materialistic or a materialist philosophy of science kind of way, and then that creates these rigid distinctions and divorces in which there's a more combative picture of theology and science, or poetry, literature and science more broadly, than we get with a broader understanding both of what scientific inquiry means and involves, which can be quite broad, and a different kind of understanding of the distinction between supernaturalist ontologies and methodologies. So that's what I was trying to put forward as a way of being able to distinguish. I think we're beyond a place where we're going to be able to achieve some sort of a happy marriage based on a supernaturalist ontology.
You do.
Among both, at least.
I mean, I think it's quite difficult to handle this dichotomy from a Christian point of view. Aristotle and Parmenides, of course, are non-Christian thinkers because they're pre-Christian thinkers. But it's easier for them to have the natural world as, in a way, spiritual or enchanted. But we work with a very sharp dichotomy between creator and created. It's very important to the faith that the distinction between creator and created is not blurred. So I rather suspect that ultimately or fundamentally all this is our fault. That the reason why there's naturalism and positivism and mechanism and all this is fundamentally a Christian reason. We've, so to speak, exiled God from the world. Now you might say, oh, this is not right. You know, God is everywhere and God is immanent in everything that we do. I think that's correct. He is. But to blur the distinction between the spiritual and the natural would actually be to give up Christianity. It's a terribly fundamental and difficult problem that we face.
It is terribly fundamental and difficult, although I would say, depending on how you read the Incarnation, it's
Yeah.
precisely that sort of
Yeah.
marriage and welding
Yeah.
of the supernatural and the material.
Yeah.
That's quite, I mean, this is what we've been trying to get at since the
Yeah.
Nicene Creed, I suppose, and before that probably. So there are ways through the difficulty.
Yeah. Through Christ, I agree. I think, but through any sort of pantheism or panentheism or Spinozism or Hegelianism, it's not really going to work.
Okay. Perhaps there are other questions as well? Thank you.
I have a couple of questions. So first, natural and supernatural. I've been very interested in this topic for a long time, and in the 13th century, the distinction gets going, but it's not the way we draw it today. So the distinction then is between the world of nature, including God as creator, and then the world of grace, in which we relate to God as I to thou, as Father. Mm-hmm. And I wondered, with the way we interpret the Romantic movement, whether we're thinking of naturalism in the very modern term, excluding God, whereas perhaps it's better to understand it in terms of the more medieval understanding of naturalism, which would include God, but only related to God as to creator. So that's one question. The other question is a practical one. So 15 months ago, the first spacecraft from this planet passed Pluto. And very exciting time, New Horizons, amazing technical achievement, as we saw the sun reflected off a new world that we'd never seen before. And the moment called for some poetry. But as the television cameras switched to the control room, the scientists were struggling with words beyond wow. And I felt that this was a moment when poetry was needed. So what on earth are we going to do to help to give... speak as a former scientist myself, us poor scientists a better vocabulary. Thank
you. Pardon me. Thank you for both of those excellent questions. The first is a wonderful one. The distinction that I was trying to tease out in my opening remarks between naturalism and supernaturalism was explicitly, the one indebted to postmodern science, the fallout from that, from modern science and the various responses that have come from that. I do think that the medieval distinction that you draw is potentially a helpful and interesting one. And I would be curious to hear you talk more about that. I mean, as I understand it, at the very same time that sort of distinction was drawn, it was overcome by an understanding as well of the ways in which grace imbues nature and back and forth, at least in the work of Thomas Aquinas that I'm most familiar with. And so there's kind of even a graced supernatural naturalism within that distinction that's quite interesting as well, or a kind of wedding in which the two can't be entirely teased apart. So I think obviously what I'm resisting in this talk and in the broader project that I'm working on is a kind of divorce. So anything that would, make these two views seem entirely oppositional to one another, and that's obviously something that the medievals hold in this kind of beautiful tension as well. So yes, I think that that's suggestive. I'm not entirely sure it addresses or speaks to all the concerns raised by naturalists in the modern era in the same way. So I think that they would still have a whole host of questions about that worldview, of course. So, but yes, this is an excellent question about Pluto and scientific vocabulary. I think that, one of the interesting things to me about modern science is that it doesn't necessarily have the wealth of vocabulary and images and narrative forms to draw on that many of these ancient poets and thinkers who were very interested in the same sorts of natural questions did. So for them to reflect on the heavens was to kind of reflect on the spiritual realm. They had this vocabulary of awe and wonder to express it with, right? Beyond wow or geez. I do think that modern poetry, and again, conceived more broadly, religion, spirituality, theology, provides us with a richer set of conceptual resources and vocabulary with which to express that sort of awe and wonder that we continue to experience. And I think, it's amazing to me. I'm not a workbench scientist, you may have guessed by now, nor was I in a former life. But many of my friends who are scientists and doctors do express that same kind of awe and wonder at just doing the most minute sorts of things and work, at their workbench. It doesn't take going to Pluto for that sort of kind of awe and inspirational moment in the face of scientific observations and studies and inquiries. So I think that that's a relatively common experience among scientists, actually, and one that could be lifted up through a different sort of conceptual vocabulary. Thank you. Yes.
I have a question again about Wordsworth in his naturalism. Okay. Ralph pointed out that you can look at some of Wordsworth's works as representing more the supernaturalist than the naturalist perspective. I wanted to point to an example which pushes back the other way, to suggest that Wordsworth's understanding of nature and a proper form of inquiry in nature isn't really, or at least in that particular poem, isn't a really scientific one. The poem that I have in mind is Tables Turned, from which we've got the famous quote, "We murder to dissect," when Wordsworth speaks about the scientific mode of inquiry into nature. He also in that poem criticizes culture, in fact, poetry, perhaps included, perhaps not, that might be open to debate, but he thinks at least that art and poetry should now strive towards a more direct approach to nature as experienced, rather than trying to break it apart and understand how it ticks, because he thinks that misses the point. So he's a naturalist in the sense that he wants a return to nature, but his return to nature, at least in that poem, isn't a scientifically founded one. Could you incorporate that in your analysis of the, or is it something that goes against the grain of it completely?
No, not at all. I mean, I think that this is why he is so interested. I think in the preface, this is why when he returns to the question of what is the poet, I think it's one of the reasons he can't quite take that up without considering what is the scientist, right? It's odd that in the heart of this, it's really a massive section of about 2,000 words that he just inserts into the middle of the preface he had already written for the preface to Lyrical Ballads. But it's this new edition where he's going to explicitly take up the question, what is a poet? And he won't do it without thinking about what is a scientist. And I think it's because he is aware that they're both after truth, and that they're both after a truth with respect to our relationship to nature, that they're both observers and interpreters of nature. But he wants to draw the distinction, which is that science is, as you said, that it has this tendency to murder to dissect, or as he said, that it can have this propensity to murder to dissect. And he's aware of that. So at the same time that he wants to depict them as both lovers of knowledge, lovers of nature, and ideally the scientist as a lover of nature that doesn't murder to dissect. And I think he holds out the possibility for that for the scientist. I think he's also deeply aware that there's never going to be a time where science becomes so advanced, even as it maintains this sort of healthy spirituality and relationship to nature, that we won't need the poet. And so for him, it's absolutely crucial that even as modern science is advancing, and that there's this certain way of examining and relating to nature to try and better understand truth, that we preserve the insights of the poet and their kind of deeper way of engaging and observing, and the kind of double vision, seeing the different layers of truth with respect to an engagement with nature. But you're right as well that his concern all the way down then is the kind of relationship that we build with nature, whether through poetry or through science. That we're creating right relationship, reconciling mind and spirit with nature, rather than all of the various forms of alienation, power over nature, that he thinks, I think, goes along with this dissecting, murdering to dissect. Thank you for that question. I have a question in the back here, and then we'll come back on.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. It is actually a comment, if I may, not a question. I would like to take a little bit different approach, and because it's theology background and the main, I would like to say something from biblical point of view, which has not been mentioned so far. You spoke about holy matrimony and poetry and science as two different concepts which need to be somehow to be united or reunion in marriage. But from biblical point of view, I think they were never separate and never divorced, because from Bible we know that first scientist as such acknowledged was King Solomon, who had knowledge of nature and so on. I don't think I have to go, we all know. And on the other hand, he has written so much poetry that it's simply hard. It would be hard to say whether he was a poet or he was a scientist. I think he was both. We have to acknowledge, and perhaps this was sort of God's idea from the very beginning, that when it's God-given wisdom comes, it both are together. These two concepts don't exist separate from each other. I think so. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. That expresses, I think, in some ways, it's very much in line with the impetus of my talk, that the unity of human knowledge, and that's a perspective that I think the romanticists are trying to preserve in the modern era. So yes, I absolutely agree, and it is something. I mean, these are all the biblical themes that they're drawing on. So when I said they're drawing on Milton's Paradise Lost and Regained, Milton's obviously extending this heritage of the biblical legacy and its reflections on the fall narrative and then the restoration and culmination in the final days. And so it's very much in line with that whole story, the biblical story, and yes, the unity of knowledge being brought together, that ultimately these ways of thinking can't be entirely divorced from one another.
May I add a brief comment on that?
Yes, please.
May I add a brief comment? Because I think the example of Solomon is so interesting and so wonderful. Thank you for bringing that up. Of course, Solomon does come to a rather bad end, because he first of all multiplies his wives excessively, and then multiplies his gods excessively. So maybe there's also a warning from the life of Solomon.
Yeah, perhaps. Thank you. Yes. Next.
I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on the turn in 20th century poetry away from abstraction towards concrete language, or whether you're more interested in romanticism. And I was just wondering whether you thought, if you agree with me, that 20th century poetry seems to avoid concepts, abstract concepts, in favour of describing situations in a very concrete way, and whether this was an attempt to become more scientific in poetry, or whether that's not really your speciality, and that's fine.
It is not my speciality. I will not presume to comment on that, but I will say, but thank you for the question. I will say that I think one of the really interesting things about Romantic poetry is that they are intent to observe the concrete everyday practices. So again, I won't make some big broad claim about the distinctions between 20th century and 19th century Romantic poetry on those grounds, but that's one of the turns that we see in Romanticism, is a turning towards the everyday, the mundane, the common, nature, natural objects, as the source for this kind of inspiration and enchantment that we need to live at one with the world and with one another. So anyway, that would be very much in line with the 20th century trend that follows, if that's the case.
Yeah. Okay. So is it part of the divorce or the marriage?
The marriage, to be sure. I mean, because it's the sense that, and again, it's an ancient insight, the sense that it's by attending to nature in various ways that we begin the journey of spiritual ascent. And you see this in the Psalms, you see this in, all sorts of ancient thinkers who talk about reading the book of nature in various ways, all the way through the ancient medieval eras. But it's carried forward, I think, in particularly interesting ways among the Romantics in the modern period at a time when there's a threat of this divorce. And the threat entails, a different kind of relationship towards nature, a desire to dominate, to control, and to master in a way that we had access to through new kinds of modern technology, but then to reduce nature to just that, right? Rather than to preserve this sort of more enchanted understanding of our relationship to the natural world.
If there aren't any more questions formally, then you're more than welcome to approach the speaker if she will answer your questions then over a glass of wine. But before that happens, please give another round of applause of thank you for our speaker.
Thank you so much.